The last thing Captain Michael Reeves transmitted was a laugh. Not a scream, not a distress call, not even a hint of panic. Just a warm, genuine laugh at 11:47 p.m. on October 3rd during a routine radio check with another vessel. 17 minutes later, his satellite tracker went dark. His 42-foot yacht, the Serenity, vanished from every radar, every tracking system, every possible method of detection humanity has devised. When the Coast Guard found his vessel 3 weeks later, drifting 200 nautical miles off course, the discovery rewrote everything we thought we knew about solo ocean sailing. Because Michael wasn't just gone. The scene inside his boat suggested he'd never been in distress at all. His coffee was still warm. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern, and what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you view every solo sailor who ventures into the Atlantic. Because the data tells a story that maritime authorities have been reluctant to publish. A statistical anomaly so disturbing that it sparked a quiet investigation involving 5 countries and the world's leading experts in maritime psychology, oceanography, and neuroscience. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover why 17 experienced solo sailors have vanished in eerily similar circumstances over the past 6 years, why their boats were all found intact with no signs of struggle, and why the answer has nothing to do with weather, equipment failure, or piracy. The truth is far more unsettling, and it lives in a space between the physical and psychological that science is only beginning to understand. What happened to these sailors could happen to anyone who underestimates the ocean's ability to reach inside the human mind and slowly, methodically dismantle it. Let me take you back to where this mystery truly begins. Not with Michael Reeves, but with a woman named Catherine Walsh, a 51-year-old maritime lawyer from Boston who had spent 3 decades studying ocean law but had never sailed solo across an ocean until the spring of 2019. Catherine wasn't reckless. She was methodical to the point of obsession. She'd completed advanced sailing certifications, survival courses in both tropical and Arctic conditions, and had logged over 5,000 hours of coastal sailing experience. Her boat, a custom-built Hallberg Rasse 40, was equipped with redundant safety systems that would make a military vessel jealous. Dual EPIRB beacons, satellite communication with automatic position reporting every 30 minutes, radar, AIS transponders, a life raft certified for 60 days of survival, and a personal locator beacon she wore on her wrist 24 hours a day. She had backup systems for her backup systems. Catherine's dream had been gestating for 27 years, since the day she watched a documentary about a female sailor completing a solo circumnavigation. The image of that sailor, standing at the bow of her yacht as dolphins played in the wake, became Catherine's North Star. She'd saved 15% of every paycheck, lived in a modest apartment despite a 6-figure income, and declined partnership at her firm specifically to preserve time for this journey. The walls of her apartment were covered with charts, weather patterns, routing strategies. Her family thought she was crazy. Her colleagues thought it was a midlife crisis. But Catherine knew it was neither. It was the thing that made her feel most alive, most herself, most connected to something greater than contracts and courtrooms and the suffocating predictability of shore life. She departed Newport, Rhode Island on April 12, 2019, at dawn. The send-off was small, just her brother and 2 close friends. She'd specifically requested no fanfare, no social media announcements until she was 3 days out. Catherine wanted to slip into the ocean quietly, to find the rhythm of solitude before the world started watching. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity: a southern route across the Atlantic to the Azores, then down to the Canaries, across to Barbados, and back up the coast to Newport. A classic milk run that thousands of sailors had completed successfully. Total duration, approximately 4 months. She had provisions for 6. The first 3 weeks were textbook perfect. Her position reports came through like clockwork every 30 minutes. Her blog updates were detailed and optimistic. She described the meditation of watchkeeping, the way stars seemed close enough to touch at night, the profound silence that exists in the middle of the ocean when the wind drops and the sails stop luffing. She posted a photo of a sunrise that received 2,000 likes. She recorded a video of herself making bread in the galley, laughing as the boat's motion sent flour everywhere. Everything about Catherine's journey suggested a dream being fulfilled exactly as planned. On May 4th, 22 days into her voyage and roughly 800 nautical miles from the Azores, Catherine's scheduled check-in with her shore contact, her brother David, had an unusual quality. David would later describe it to investigators as off, but not alarming. Catherine seemed distracted, kept pausing mid-sentence, and mentioned seeing something strange in the water that she couldn't quite identify. When David pressed her on it, she laughed it off, said it was probably just fatigue playing tricks on her eyes, and changed the subject to a technical issue with her wind generator. The call ended normally. She said she loved him. She said she'd call again in 2 days. She never made that call. Catherine's satellite tracker continued transmitting for another 16 hours, showing her maintaining course at a steady 5 knots. Then, at 3:22 a.m. on May 5th, the tracker went silent. Not offline, not transmitting an emergency signal, just silent, as if someone had simply switched it off. Her EPIRB never activated. Her personal locator beacon never sent a distress signal. The automatic position reporting system that was hardwired into the boat's electrical system and designed to be impossible to disable without tools went dark. Every single method of tracking Catherine Walsh vanished simultaneously. The Coast Guard launched a massive search operation. Aircraft covered thousands of square miles. Nearby vessels were diverted to search patterns. Satellite imagery was analyzed. For 11 days, the Atlantic was scoured with technology and manpower that represented millions of dollars in resources. Nothing. No debris field, no life raft, no oil slick, no wreckage. It was as if Catherine and her boat had been plucked from the ocean by an invisible hand. Then on May 16th, a cargo ship spotted something. A yacht, sails furled neatly, drifting in a lazy circle about 300 nautical miles southwest of her last known position. The Hallberg Rasse 40, Catherine's boat. When the Coast Guard boarded the vessel, what they found defied every expectation. The boat was immaculate. No damage to the hull, no water intrusion, no signs of collision or grounding. The sails were properly furled and secured. The engine was off, but functional. All safety equipment was in its proper place, unused. The life raft was still in its canister. In the galley, a half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter beside a glass of water. Catherine's foul weather gear hung on its designated hook. Her personal locator beacon, the one she supposedly wore constantly, was sitting on the navigation desk, turned off. The Coast Guard investigators documented everything with forensic precision. They found Catherine's laptop open in the main cabin, the screen dark, but the battery still holding a charge. When they accessed it later, they discovered the last entry in her ship's log, typed at 2:47 a.m. on May 5th, 35 minutes before her tracking systems went dark. The entry was a single sentence. "I finally understand what they mean when they say the ocean calls to you." Below that, the log was blank, but in her personal journal, handwritten in increasingly erratic script across the final pages, investigators found something that made them immediately classify the case and restrict access to the finding. The journal entries from her final week described experiences that started subtly, a sense of being watched, shadows moving in her peripheral vision, the feeling that someone else was on the boat with her. Catherine, a rational attorney trained in skepticism, had initially dismissed these sensations as products of isolation and sleep deprivation. She documented them clinically, almost anthropologically, as if studying her own psychological state. But the entries progressed. She began describing voices, conversations she could almost hear beneath the sound of water against the hull. She wrote about dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams where she was swimming in water so clear and warm that she never wanted to leave. She described an overwhelming compulsion to go swimming at night, a desire so intense that she'd physically tied herself to the mast on multiple occasions to prevent herself from jumping overboard. The final entry, written in handwriting barely recognizable as hers, read, "It's not frightening anymore. They've been waiting for me. I understand now. The ocean doesn't take sailors, it welcomes them home." The Coast Guard investigator who first read that journal entry was a veteran of 30 years in maritime accident investigation. He'd seen drownings, hypothermia deaths, murder-suicides, every conceivable tragedy the sea could produce. He immediately recognized that Catherine's journal described something he'd encountered only twice before in his career, in cases so unusual they'd never been publicly disclosed. He made a phone call to a colleague in the UK Royal National Lifeboat Institution. That colleague made a call to the French Maritime Rescue Coordination Centre. Within 48 hours, an unofficial working group had been formed, and the members began sharing files they'd been keeping quiet for years. The pattern was undeniable. Since 2017, 17 solo sailors had vanished in the Atlantic under nearly identical circumstances. Experienced sailors, well-equipped boats, no distress calls, vessels found intact with no signs of struggle, and in 12 of the cases where personal journals or logs were recovered, descriptions of psychological phenomena that progressed from mild paranoia to complete dissociation from reality. The geographical distribution was telling. All of the disappearances occurred in a specific corridor of the Atlantic, roughly between the latitudes of 25 and 35 degrees north, in waters ranging from 3 to 5,000 meters deep. This wasn't the Bermuda Triangle sensationalism of decades past. This was real, documented, and happening with increasing frequency. Dr. Elena Rostova, a maritime psychologist at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, was brought into the investigation in late 2019. Her specialty was the psychological effects of prolonged isolation on solo sailors, a field that had received limited attention despite the growing popularity of solo ocean voyages. Dr. Rostova had spent 15 years studying the mental health challenges faced by single-handed sailors, submariners, Antarctic researchers, and astronauts. She'd published papers on temporal disorientation, auditory hallucinations, and the phenomenon known as the third man factor, where isolated individuals report feeling the presence of an invisible companion. When Dr. Rostova reviewed the case files, she immediately recognized elements from all of her research, but combined in a way she'd never seen before. The progression was too consistent to be coincidental, too specific to be random psychological breaks. She proposed a hypothesis that was initially met with skepticism, but gradually gained acceptance as more data emerged. Dr. Rostova suggested that solo sailors in certain oceanic conditions were experiencing a form of environmentally induced dissociative state, a trance-like condition, where the boundary between self and environment became dangerously blurred. The mechanism, she theorized, involved multiple factors converging simultaneously. The sensory deprivation of solo sailing, particularly at night, the constant motion of the boat creating a subtle vestibular disruption that the brain struggles to process over extended periods, the electromagnetic fields generated by the boat's electrical systems interacting with the human nervous system in still poorly understood ways, and perhaps most critically, the infrasound generated by ocean swells. Infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, had been studied in connection with haunted houses, where low-frequency vibrations from wind or mechanical systems created feelings of unease and visual hallucinations. The ocean generates infrasound constantly. A solo sailor, isolated in a small vessel, would be immersed in these inaudible frequencies 24 hours a day for weeks or months. Dr. Rostova's team conducted experiments. They placed volunteers in isolation chambers with motion platforms that simulated the movement of a small yacht, exposed them to recorded ocean sounds, including infrasound frequencies, and monitored their psychological state over periods ranging from 48 to 96 hours. The results were disturbing. After approximately 60 hours, 73% of participants reported unusual sensory experiences. Shadows in peripheral vision, the sense of being watched, auditory hallucinations. After 80 hours, 41% reported strong compulsions to leave the isolation chamber despite having been briefed extensively on the experiment's parameters and given safe words to exit at any time. Several participants later described these compulsions as feeling external, as if they were being called or summoned rather than making autonomous decisions. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Rostova's hypothesis was correct, solo ocean sailing in certain conditions wasn't just physically dangerous, it was psychologically destabilizing in ways that could override survival instincts and rational decision-making. The ocean wasn't just a physical environment to navigate. It was a sensory environment that could, given the right combination of factors, fundamentally alter consciousness. But the mystery deepened when investigators began examining the specific locations where sailors had vanished. The corridor between 25 and 35 degrees north wasn't arbitrary. This was a region where several ocean currents converged, creating complex water movements and unusually stable atmospheric conditions. It was also a region where the ocean floor dropped to abyssal depths with dramatic suddenness. Oceanographers noted that the bathymetry, the underwater topology, created acoustic conditions that could amplify and focus infrasound in unusual ways. Essentially, this section of the Atlantic might function as a massive resonance chamber, concentrating frequencies that elsewhere in the ocean would dissipate harmlessly. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physical oceanographer from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, joined the investigation and brought another piece of the puzzle. He'd been studying bioluminescent organisms in deep ocean environments and had noticed unusual patterns of bioluminescence in the exact region where sailors were vanishing. Deep-sea organisms were producing light displays at night that, when viewed from the surface, could create mesmerizing, almost hypnotic visual effects. Sailors alone at night, already in compromised psychological states from infrasound exposure and isolation, watching these light displays dance across the water, might experience them as communications, as invitations, as something alive and intentional. The working group faced an ethical dilemma. They had evidence, circumstantial but compelling, that a specific region of the Atlantic Ocean might be genuinely dangerous to solo sailors, not because of weather or waves, but because of its ability to induce psychological states that led to fatal decisions. But how do you warn people about invisible environmental factors that sound like science fiction? How do you tell experienced sailors that their minds might betray them in ways they can't predict or resist? They decided to publish their findings in a peer-reviewed maritime safety journal in early 2021, carefully worded to avoid sensationalism, but clear in its implications. The paper recommended that solo sailors crossing the Atlantic avoid prolonged stays in the affected corridor, maintain more frequent communication with shore contacts, and be aware of psychological warning signs. The response from the sailing community was mixed. Some took the warnings seriously, others dismissed it as academic overreach, pointing out that thousands of sailors had crossed this same stretch of ocean without incident. And then, in August 2022, Michael Reeves set out from Charleston, South Carolina, on his solo Atlantic crossing. Michael was 63, a retired airline pilot with 40 years of flying experience and a passion for sailing he'd cultivated since childhood. If anyone understood risk management, situational awareness, and the importance of following safety protocols, it was Michael. He'd read Dr. Rostova's paper. He'd discussed it with other sailors. He'd promised his wife that he'd route around the affected area, adding several days to his crossing, but avoiding the corridor entirely. Michael's route plan showed him swinging north, well above 35 degrees latitude. His shore contact, his daughter Emily, had a copy of his intended track and was monitoring his progress obsessively. For the first 12 days, Michael stayed precisely on course, exactly where he'd said he'd be. His communications were regular and upbeat. He sent photos of sunsets, videos of dolphins, voice messages describing the joy of being back at sea after years of planning and preparation. Emily felt confident. Her father was doing exactly what he'd promised. On day 13, Emily noticed a deviation. Small at first, just a few degrees south of his intended track. She texted him. He replied that he'd adjusted course to avoid a weather system developing to the north. It made sense. Emily checked the weather forecasts herself, and yes, there was a low-pressure system forming. Her father's decision seemed prudent. But over the next 24 hours, Michael's course continued to drift southward. By day 14, he was at 36 degrees north. By day 15, he'd crossed into the corridor. Emily called him. The conversation, recorded by Emily as she often did to save her father's sailing stories, lasted 8 minutes. Michael sounded normal, cheerful even. He explained that the winds were better on this course, that he was making excellent time, that the boat was handling beautifully. When Emily mentioned that he was entering the area Dr. Rostova had warned about, Michael laughed, not dismissively, but warmly, the way you laugh at a child's concern about monsters under the bed. He assured her he was fine, that he was being careful, that he'd been sailing for 40 years and knew how to recognize when something was wrong. He said he'd call again tomorrow. That call came, but it was different. Michael's voice had a dreamlike quality. He spoke slowly, with long pauses between thoughts. He mentioned that he'd been having the most vivid dreams of his life, dreams about flying but underwater, about breathing water like air. He said the ocean at night was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, even more beautiful than the view from 30,000 feet. When Emily asked if he was getting enough sleep, Michael said sleep and waking felt the same now, that it didn't matter which state he was in. Emily felt the first real spike of fear. She begged him to activate his EPIRB, to call the Coast Guard, to let someone come check on him. Michael laughed again, that same warm laugh, and said, "Emily, sweetheart, I've never been better. I've finally found what I was looking for." The call ended. 12 hours later, at 11:47 p.m., Michael made his routine radio check with another vessel in the area, a cargo ship called the Maritime Express. The radio operator later told investigators that Michael sounded completely normal, even jovial. They discussed weather, swapped sailing stories, and laughed about the challenges of cooking in rough seas. The operator remembered thinking that Michael seemed like exactly the kind of sailor you hope to encounter on the ocean. Competent, friendly, at peace with his choice to sail alone. 17 minutes after that radio call, every tracking system on Michael's boat went silent. The pattern held, the terrible, inexplicable pattern. When the Coast Guard found the Serenity 3 weeks later, the scene was now familiar to the investigators who'd been following these cases. No damage, no signs of struggle, all safety equipment present and unused. But there were unique details that added depth to the mystery. Michael's laptop showed that he'd been researching oceanography websites, specifically pages about bioluminescence and deep ocean creatures. His final log entry, typed at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after his cheerful radio call, read, "I finally understand why we're drawn to the sea. It's not adventure, it's recognition. We're returning to where we began." And there was the coffee, a cup sitting on the navigation desk, still 1/3 full. When investigators tested it later, chemical analysis showed it had been poured approximately 4 to 5 hours before the boat was found. Not 3 weeks, not even 3 days, 4 to 5 hours. The implications were impossible but undeniable. Either someone had been on that boat recently, or the coffee had been preserved in a way that defied understanding. The investigation into Michael Reeves' disappearance forced a reckoning. The pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or explained away by conventional maritime accident theory. Dr. Rostova's working group expanded to include neurologists, acoustic engineers, and experts in altered states of consciousness. They reviewed every piece of evidence, every journal entry, every recorded communication from all 17 cases. What emerged was a theory that still generates controversy, but fits the data better than any alternative explanation. The theory suggests that the specific combination of environmental factors in this corridor of the Atlantic, infrasound frequencies, electromagnetic variations, bioluminescent visual stimuli, extreme isolation, and perhaps other factors not yet identified, can induce a dissociative state so powerful that it overrides the most basic survival instinct, the instinct to remain alive. Sailors in this state don't perceive themselves as being in danger. They perceive themselves as being called, welcomed, invited into something that feels profoundly right and necessary. The ocean in this formulation isn't malevolent, it's seductive. It offers an experience that the isolated, overwhelmed human mind interprets as transcendent, as a form of homecoming. The most disturbing aspect of this theory is its implication about consciousness itself. If environmental factors can so completely alter perception and decision-making without the individual being aware of the alteration, what does that say about the reliability of subjective experience? Catherine Walsh, an attorney trained in critical thinking, couldn't recognize that her perceptions were being distorted. Michael Reeves, a pilot who'd spent decades managing complex systems under pressure, couldn't identify that his judgment was compromised. If they couldn't see it happening to themselves, who could? The maritime community has responded to these findings with a mix of acceptance and resistance. New safety protocols have been proposed, buddy systems even for solo sailors, mandatory check-ins with more detailed mental status questions, GPS tracking systems that can't be manually disabled, algorithms that detect unusual course deviations and automatically alert shore contacts. Some sailing organizations now require psychological screening before certifying sailors for solo ocean passages. Others argue this is an overreaction, that the ocean has always been dangerous, and that attempting to regulate away all risk destroys the essential nature of the adventure. But the disappearances have slowed. In the 3 years since the findings were published and warning systems implemented, only 2 solo sailors have vanished in the Atlantic corridor, compared to 17 in the previous 6 years. Both of those sailors had ignored specific warnings and had documented histories of dismissing safety protocols. The reduction isn't proof. Correlation isn't causation, but it suggests that awareness alone might be protective. Knowing that the danger exists, understanding the psychological mechanisms, maintaining hypervigilance about one's own mental state, these cognitive tools might be enough to resist the ocean's seduction. What happened to Catherine Walsh, Michael Reeves, and the 15 others remains officially classified as missing at sea, cause undetermined. Their bodies were never recovered. The precise mechanism of how they left their boats, assuming they did leave their boats, remains unknown. But the evidence points to a conclusion that challenges our understanding of how environment affects consciousness. They didn't leave their boats because they were in distress. They left because they wanted to, because in that moment, with their perceptions radically altered by factors they couldn't see or resist, leaving the boat and entering the ocean felt like the most natural, necessary, right thing they'd ever done. This is the nightmare that haunts maritime psychologists and the families of the lost sailors. The idea that in their final moments, these experienced, cautious, intelligent people felt joy, that they weren't victims of the ocean's violence, but converts to something they perceived as beautiful and true, that they walked into the water willingly, perhaps eagerly, believing they were finally going home. The lesson here transcends sailing. It's a lesson about the fragility of consciousness, about how thin the membrane is between rational thought and something far more primal. We like to believe we're in control of our decisions, that our perceptions are reliable, that we'd recognize if our minds were being manipulated by external forces. These sailors prove otherwise. They were smart, prepared, experienced, and absolutely certain they were thinking clearly, even as they made decisions that led to their deaths. For anyone who ventures into isolated environments, whether at sea, in the wilderness, or even in extreme conditions of stress and solitude, the message is clear. Trust your protocols more than your instincts. Maintain connections to external reality and understand that your brain, That miraculous organ that navigates complexity every day can be hijacked by environmental factors you can't perceive. The ocean's greatest danger isn't in its storms or its size. It's in its ability to whisper directly to the most ancient parts of our minds, the parts that existed before language, before reason, before we ever learned to be afraid of the dark water. The Atlantic corridor remains. Ships pass through it daily. Solo sailors still cross it, though more carefully now, with better awareness and more robust safety systems. The infrasound still resonates through the deep water. The bioluminescence still dances at night. The environmental factors that can dismantle human consciousness remain exactly as they've always been. We've simply learned to recognize the danger and respect it. But 17 sailors are gone, vanished without a trace, and their final moments remain a mystery that science can only partially illuminate. Somewhere in that corridor of ocean, at depths where light never reaches, the truth of what happened to them rests in water so deep and cold that it might as well be another world entirely. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the ocean keeps its secrets for a reason. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only respected, remembered, and learned from. If you're moved by this story, if it changes how you think about the ocean or about the reliability of your own mind, share it. Tell other sailors, other adventurers, other people who push themselves into isolated places where the environment can speak louder than reason. The best memorial for Catherine, Michael, and the others isn't grief. It's awareness. It's making sure their deaths weren't meaningless, that the pattern they revealed saves lives going forward. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the ocean's mysteries and the lessons they teach us about the human mind, the fragile nature of consciousness, and the beautiful, terrible power of the sea. And if you ever find yourself alone on the ocean, hearing voices in the water, seeing things that seem too beautiful to be real, remember these 17 sailors and do what they couldn't. Recognize the danger, trust your safety protocols, and come home.